Russian soldiers surrendered to drones. The 3rd Assault Brigade released a video from the Kharkiv region. The defenders cleared enemy positions and captured Russian occupiers using only FPV drones and ground robotic systems. Again, using drones, they were led to Ukrainian positions, after which the fighters of the 3rd Assault Brigade took them prisoner. Meanwhile, Special Operations Forces soldiers discovered and destroyed a rare Russian army remote mining engineering system called Zemlodali. The cost of such a system is $25 million. This is quite modern equipment. It was first shown during the parade in Moscow in 2020. Ukrainian forces also destroyed another Russian Buk-1 surface-to-air missile system. Thanks to precise reconnaissance work, drone adjustments, and accurate fire, they managed to hit an air defense system worth about $10 million. The Buk was covering the positions of Russian occupiers from Ukrainian Air Force strikes. Meanwhile, on the Lyman front, the enemy tried to attack near Redkadub, Karpivka, and Zelina Dolina. On the Pokrovsk front, Russian occupiers attempted to push the Ukrainian armed forces out of their positions in the areas of Poltavka, Novotoretsk, Myrnorad, Myrolubivka, Kotline, and Udakny. And on the Novopavlivka front, the invaders attacked near Myrn, Zeliny High, and the village of Shevchenko.
There is no talk of any significant successes with the Second Russian Army. Yes, they are advancing, trying to advance. What we're calling it now is the Spring-Summer Offensive Operation. Actually, it's already summer. This offensive is unfolding on several fronts. It's happening on land, in the air, and now also in the information space. But to say that they have achieved any of the successes they set out for themselves, I wouldn't say that right now.
In the Torets direction, fighters from the 28th Separate Mechanized Brigade named after the Knights of the Winter campaign stopped another assault attempt by the Russian army. Thanks to the scouts, they managed to spot 2 tanks with infantry moving toward the Ukrainian positions. First, they were stopped by artillery, and then FPV drones joined the action. The tanks tried to drop off infantry near the tree lines, but as a result of FPV drone strikes, the landing party was eliminated. 1 tank was also destroyed, and another was set on fire and put out of action. At the same time, the main intelligence directorate of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense intercepted a conversation between Russian soldiers about using chemical weapons on the front against Ukrainian troops. In the intercepted conversation, the Russians discussed preparations for using chemical weapons against the positions of Ukrainian defenders. Earlier, the main intelligence directorate reported that the occupiers are systematically using chemicals on the front. For example, in the Zaporizhia region, there are increasingly frequent cases of the Russian army using munitions with poisonous gas. In the same Zaporizhia direction, the artillerymen of the 44th Brigade carried out a successful counter-battery operation. With the help of drones and artillery, they destroyed at least 4 MSTB howitzers belonging to the Russian occupiers, along with their ammunition. Meanwhile, the drone systems forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine released a video showing the destruction of heavy flamethrower systems of the Russian army. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, since the start of the full-scale invasion, the Russian army has already lost 100 such combat vehicles. Among them are the TOS-1 Buratino systems, TOS-1 Assault Sapyak, as well as the newer TOS-2 on a wheeled chassis. Over the past day, the Defense Forces of Ukraine eliminated 1,050 Russian soldiers. This was reported by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Ukrainian defenders also destroyed 5 tanks, 2 armored combat vehicles, 68 artillery systems, 1 air defense system, and shot down 227 drones. In addition, more than 120 units of vehicles and special equipment belonging to the Russian occupiers were destroyed.
We have Denis Popovich with us, military analyst. Denis, welcome. Glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes.
Denis, to start, I'd like you to comment on Syrsky's statement about the fact that indeed the Ukrainian armed forces are holding their positions in the Kursk and Belgorod regions, thereby tying down enemy forces, but of course, also accomplishing other operational objectives. Tell me, what are those objectives? What do they generally consist of? If you look at the situation like this, well, generally speaking, yes. In general,
Their main purpose is to hold back Russian troops, to tie them down so they can't redeploy freed-up units to other directions, like the Sumy region. That's the current mission of those Ukrainian forces that are on Russian territory in the Belgorod and Kursk regions. That's the main task, the purpose, and the goal for today.
MHM. Denis, what about that group that was reported earlier? How many? Several tens of thousands, right. There was a group near Sumy region? We saw those OFFI, those reports, and, accordingly, we talked about how, well, the enemy is really considering, at the very least, harassing and shelling the border areas of that region. But as we understand it, right now the immediate threat of shelling, yes, many cities in Ukraine are feeling it, but the city of Sumy, the regional center, is first and foremost if we're talking about that direction, right? How do you assess the situation there specifically?
Well, the group that was there is still there, in the Sumy region. They're trying to advance in the Sumy region. Their task is to create a buffer zone. And their objective was to get as close to Sumy as possible so that, as you rightly said, they could take control of, create the threat of artillery and FPV drone strikes to make life more fun for the people of Sumy. Fun in quotation marks. I'm speaking ironically, bitterly so. That's it. But, so far the Russian army hasn't accomplished that task. Right now we're talking about the fact that we're moving on to counterattacks in this area. And now the Russian army is being forced to transfer reinforcements to the Sumy region. In other words, the Russian army's offensive in the Sumy region has run out of steam. They're now having to focus on strengthening this group. And as of today, I want to repeat once again, they are not achieving the goals they set for themselves.
Tell me, please, if we're talking about what plans they might be making within, well, again, you and I have already discussed this thing called the Summer Offensive Operation. Although we understand that, in principle, they aren't giving up on trying to advance. Right? So now, the losses. How much, let's say, is there any correlation, yes, between the lives lost, if we can call it that, talking about these representatives of the occupying army, right? And this ratio as of now, if we're talking about certain advances by the enemy in specific areas, basically, how does this, in turn, earlier we mentioned the position voiced by the president of the Czech Republic, Pavel, who said that if we're talking about some kind of successes, yes, or some kind of victory or so on, then Pavel, as a professional military man, says that that victory, in particular, looks completely different. Right? This is a very high price that the Russian Federation's army is paying right now.
Well, Petr Pavel's assessments are worth listening to. His views are quite sober. Not just quite, they are completely sober. He's one of those politicians.
He really sees things as they are, yes.
Who gives absolutely clear-headed assessments. And honestly, looking back at his previous comments, I haven't seen any of them diverge from reality. That is, if you recall what he said about our counteroffensive in 23, he claimed that if we didn't take advantage, didn't make use of that window we had back then, it would be very difficult for us to carry out such a counteroffensive in the future. And unfortunately, time has shown that he was right. That's why the assessments of this political figure, who in the past was a general is always a general, there are no former generals, he is a general. He held a very high position within the NATO structure. The assessments of Peter Pavel, should be listened to very carefully. He assessed the situation very accurately. According to the results for June, if I'm not mistaken, the enemy suffered losses of more than 32,000 servicemen. In fact, these losses are relatively small. That is, if you look at the ratio, yes, there were months when the enemy lost far more servicemen, even over 40,000. That's it. But this is explained by the fact that in June the enemy largely resorted to attacks by small groups. Obviously, that's exactly why the level of losses is relatively low. But if you look at their territorial gains, yes, they are also quite significant from a technical standpoint, since the enemy was advancing in the Sumy region and continues its offensive in the Novopavlovsk direction, that is, in the south of the Donetsk region. But all these territorial gains are mostly tactical in nature. Nowhere has the Ukrainian army suffered a major defeat, and there have been no recorded cases of our units being encircled and destroyed. And if the army is putting up organized resistance, even if it is retreating, but doing so in an organized way, delivering counterstrikes, maintaining an active defense, and carrying out counteroffensive operations in particular, as we are counterattacking in the Sumy region, I want to emphasize that again, then there can be no talk of any significant successes on the part of the Russian army. Yes, they are conducting an offensive, trying to advance. What we are calling it now is the Spring-Summer Offensive Operation. Actually, it's already summer. This offensive is unfolding on several fronts. It's happening on land, in the air, and now also in the information space. But I wouldn't say that they have achieved any of the successes they had planned for themselves.
You mentioned the information space. What do you mean by that? Are you talking about the strikes on the TCCs that we're seeing now? Or is it more about the attempts to scale up these attacks, like what happened last night? Right? I don't think there's a single person who, let's be honest, even got a decent night's sleep, let alone those people who, as part of mobile fire teams and air defense forces, were trying to shoot down everything that was flying toward peaceful Ukrainian cities. Let me remind you, it was about 750, military aviation type weapons that the enemy used, correct? More than 700 drones, and there were also Kinzhal missiles, Kh-101s, and Iskander-K. All these types of missiles were launched to Ukrainian cities. Go ahead, Dennis.
The information space, yes, that's definitely a new factor now. These are systematic strikes on the territorial recruitment centers. And we see that the enemy is using this very actively. They are looking for people in Ukrainian society who support this. And unfortunately, such people do exist. These strikes are targeted specifically at those people. In other words, the enemy is trying to single out a segment of such citizens in order to further work with them through information campaigns, and in this way drive a wedge between the army and society. Because the territorial centers are also part of the army, they are structures of the armed forces of Ukraine. And when there are people who gloat over the strikes on the territorial centers, well, this is just how they end up working for the enemy, helping them drive a wedge between society and the army. Of course, there may be very real reasons for this. Maybe some of them have even suffered from illegal actions by the territorial center surrogates. That happens too. It's important to understand that just because the enemy tries to use these people for their own purposes, that doesn't make the Russian Federation our ally, right? In other words, we can't forget that the Russian Federation is striking our cities, causing countless casualties, civilians, destruction, and so on. So, we need to assess this situation correctly. And on top of that, the enemy is also trying to work with our allies to cut off our Western aid, to deprive us of Western support. This is also a direction the enemy is now pursuing very actively.
Dennis, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for this analysis. Dennis Popovic, military observer, was with us.